being an economist, he's also a lover of Star Wars. Today he combines the two into a single speech.
Yay.
Avoiding economic collapse in a post-Death Star galaxy.
Nice.
Paul Nichols, avoiding economic collapse in a post-Death Star galaxy.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters. To prove, I brought the paper to prove that it is an actual technical paper that I avoiding economic collapse in a post-Death Star galaxy. Who's familiar with Star Wars? Who's not familiar with Star Wars? That's a more important question for this speech. Is there anyone not familiar with Star Wars? Okay. Well, then I have the setting for you. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I'm going to adjust this a little bit. There. The core of the paper is entitled, "It's a Trap, Emperor Palpatine's Poison Pill." For those that may not remember, the Emperor was an enterprising fellow that thought the galaxy would be better managed by him and him alone. The key question that comes out of this paper today is, what economic resources would the Rebel Alliance, those enterprising young people that thought they could better govern with democracy and free will, what economic resources would they need in order to have prevented the financial crisis that would have resulted from the destruction of 2 Death Stars and the death of the Imperial leader, Emperor Palpatine? To get an answer to that question really means we had to develop a model that determined what was the potential economic risk to the galaxy of the Emperor's death and the destruction of those Death Stars. We have to figure out what, and that breaks down further into what is the size of the galactic economy. How do we determine what the size of the galactic economy is? And then what is the fallout? How does the fallout roll out after the destruction of the second Death Star? So let's get some to start at the very core nugget of that. We're going to start by telling you how we determined the cost of a Death Star. We will stretch that over to what that means for measuring the entire gross galactic product. Then we'll talk about a little bit about the banking system in Star Wars, which is a legitimate, actual, canonized piece of the story. Talk about what we think the statistical models said for the fallout. And then as a result, we'll be able to tell you what was actually required, what had been required by the Rebel Alliance in order to prevent that economic collapse. And a couple of key recommendations at the very end as a result. So your Death Star construction, just your basic, run-of-the-mill, fresh off the line, first-time Death Star. Also known as the DS-1 Orbital Battle Station. These costs are in 2012 US dollars. And largely they're based on government statistics around the costs of everything, whether it's steel, and the technology is based off of the USS Gerald Ford. I would have loved it to have been the USS Enterprise, but then we get into cross-star galaxy stories. Anyway, the USS Gerald Ford is the most modern US battleship with data available. So that we use that technological cost to expound into the Death Star development. As you see, we're in the quadrillions, the hundreds of quadrillions of dollars just in steel alone to develop the first smaller Death Star. 852, and that's quoted by the US government off of another paper, but it was actually quoted by the US government. The R&D costs for the technology, the laser, all the other pieces come to $192.8 quintillion. So decidedly more than just the steel. The steel is actually a bargain in the overall cost. And this is based on expanding what we needed for the USS Gerald Ford and taking it to the size of the Death Star. So the total cost of the first Death Star, which is markedly smaller than the second Death Star, $193 quintillion. Just, Raymond, can I take a loan from you? I had this idea. I just need a little bit of cash. The second Death Star was even more expensive. It was orders of magnitude larger. We do assume in the modeling that the R&D costs were not substantially greater than this because they already had the technology. We're just expanding and making it larger. So really, the extra cost in the second Death Star, which we don't need to really get into individual costs, comes from increased steel for the size, but not R&D. Why is the Death Star important? Because you need to know what the galaxy is worth. If you don't know what the galaxy is worth, how are you going to tell what kind of financial crisis is going to occur and what you need to stop it? So we use the first Death Star to determine, as a fragment, a government-based project, to determine what the overall gross galactic product is. And we tie this to the Manhattan Project, because this is the closest thing that we could use. The Manhattan Project didn't run 20 years like the Death Star project did. It ran 4 or 5 years. But it was beyond, it was the most groundbreaking study and research and R&D project that we can think of that's even close to being comparable. And what we know is that it represented just a little less than 1/4% of the gross domestic product of the United States at the time that it was being produced. Over the course of the 4 years, averaged out 1/4%, just shy of that. So what we do is we just take that same 0.21% of gross domestic product in the U.S. and we say we're going to do that over the 20-year lifespan of the Death Star project. And so we know, by going back, that we were 1.93 or 193 quintillion. Go over 20 years. We're now, the overall gross galactic product for over 20 years is $92 sextillion. When you average that by 20, $4.6 sextillion is the gross galactic product in any given year for the Empire. Really, really could use a loan, Raymond. You sure? So Paul, we now know the imaginary costs of this imaginary galaxy, which, if it's a long time ago and far, far away, how do you know it's imaginary, really? But what does that mean for the banking system? Well, digging through the canonized material in Star Wars, we do know that there was a robust banking system. And there's a key intergalactic banking plan that plays into, for those that are familiar with Star Wars, the prequel movies. And they were determined to be, we can look at them as the only bank in the entire galaxy that was deemed too big to fail. And the reason we can determine that it was too big to fail is that once Emperor Palpatine took over, he nationalized the bank. Clearly, too, because all the loans for the first Death Star had come from that bank, too big to fail, so he nationalized it. And what we do to understand what percentage of the gross galactic product that the banking system represented was by comparing it to the U.S. Federal Reserve activities during key periods of intervention. And what the best key periods of intervention when you're comparing Star Wars are other types of war, particularly World War II, but the Great Depression is also valuable in that the Empire was somewhat cruel to its various planets and systems throughout that it would control. So we take a look at those two periods to determine kind of what part of the overall gross galactic product was held by the banking system. And we know that during these two periods, the U.S. Federal Reserve held in assets approximately 20% of nominal gross domestic product. So all we do is make that same assumption that I lost an eye, apology there, that the International Galactic Banking Clan held similar 20% as the largest bank in the system. That said, they were not the only bank. There were a number of other banks. The Intergalactic Banking Clan was the only one too big to fail, but there were 1.75 million full member worlds. One bank isn't handling all of those. We assume one bank for every 100 worlds, or one big bank for every 100 worlds. And of those 100, each of those 100 banks, one is massive. So now you see the pyramid structure. I'm not going to use that, but you get the idea. At the peak, intergalactic banking clan, too big to fail, top of the food chain. That next strata, massive banks, one out of every 100 big banks, and then you've got the rest of the big banks. And then you have the number of banks that aren't big enough to actually play into the overall critical infrastructure within the economy. So we have 17,501 notable banks. The assumption is that this represents 1/3 of the entire banking sector, and that represents 60% of the overall gross galactic product. So now, just to recap, we kind of see that we've gone from using a Death Star and figured out how we cost the Death Star using the US military, and then we take that Death Star to help us model the larger gross galactic product, and then we take that gross galactic product and figure out how it's distributed amongst the banks in the entire galaxy. Crisis. Second Death Star destroyed. Impact of the Imperial financial crisis. What would have happened? Well, we make a brief assumption that over that 20-year period, we managed to pay off half of the first Death Star. So we have a second Death Star that's completely unpaid for. It's like having two houses. Who has two houses? Who needs two Death Stars? The total unpaid debt for the Death Star, we figure, is $515.5 quintillion. We also assume a 20% market drop from the rebel terrorist attacks on the second Death Star too, and we base those attacks off the September 11th attacks to the US. And then we also look at bank shortfalls and realize that collapse is imminent because there is no, with the loss of the empire, no Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation equivalent. That's now gone. So we have a major impact to the International Galactic Banking Clan. What would it take to stop this, to stop it in its tracks? We ran a number of simulations and we got two key results. Scenario one, if we want to limit the loss to a maximum of 1% of the gross galactic product, we're putting in greater than 15% of that same gross galactic product into the massive and big banks just to minimize the loss to 1%. If we want to keep it even smaller, to limit the losses to 1% in only the worst 10% of banking cases, we're putting in more than 21% of the gross galactic product. We are talking big money. Raymond, where is that loan? Seriously, we are in trouble here, my man. Never, ever tell me the odds. As Han Solo said, you just go forward regardless. But there are some key considerations that we should consider, even if we don't want to know the odds. For the Rebel Alliance to try to pay this back, we're considering a group that has fought a 20-year war. They're a ragtag bunch. They don't have a great central banking system of their own. They have an inability to fund major projects like the Death Star. And they have no proven track record of long-term planning. They are just battling it out, trying to overthrow the Empire. And there is no identified resources worth even close to the amount that we need for this bailout. So our conclusions are that the destruction of the Death Star and the subsequent collapse of the Empire would result in an economic meltdown of galactic proportions. The bailout would require something between 15 and 21% of the gross galactic product, and then we got a bunch of ragtag rebels that have no way of paying their debts. This is the Joe from the army that went and got the Ferrari from Stinky Pete used car salesman with no money down and no credit check. We have a problem. Based on the following, we have one recommendation. If you're going to overthrow an empire, make sure you got some cash to fill in when the whole thing collapses. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.